Yay! Hello, welcome anyone on the internet watching this. This is the Jazz Boundaries panel. Again, I'm Ryan Bañagale from Colorado College, and I'm excited to introduce our first speaker this morning. INGRID RACINE is a trumpet player, composer, and cultural organizer based in Southeast Michigan. She holds a BFA in Jazz Studies and a Master of Music in Improvisation from the University of Michigan, where she studied with Donald Walden, Ellen Rowe, Ingrid Jensen, and Jerry Allen. She continued her education performing in ensembles led by Wendell Harrison, Marion Payton, and James DePogny. Ingrid is currently a doctoral pre-candidate in ethnomusicology at the University of Michigan. Her research is centered on the construction of place and sense of belonging in local jazz scenes and the social work performed by culture bearers in Detroit, Michigan. The title of her talk today is Whose Festival? Complicating Renaissance annually at the Detroit Jazz Festival. Please join me in welcoming INGRID RACINE.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. What about? Welcome to Detroit. If this window was open, you would have actually the perfect prop for this paper because we are sitting right outside Park Plaza, which you see on the slide here. Whose Festival? Complicating Renaissance at the Detroit Jazz Festival. Can you all hear me okay? When saxophonist Chris Collins was appointed artistic director of the Detroit Jazz Festival in 2012, he announced, "I want the festival to be seen as the Detroit Jazz Festival, not just a jazz festival in Detroit." Last year's festival appeared to live up to this vision. It featured 3 NEA jazz masters, Louis Hayes, Regina Carter, and Kenny Garrett, all from Detroit. Drummer Kareem Riggins was named Artist in Residence and would curate 4 nights of concerts honoring the legendary Detroit hip-hop producer, Jay Dilla. The first evening would include a Detroit-centric tribute to the late festival benefactor Reginald Blade, including a performance of composer Gerald Wilson's piece, Detroit. But a few days prior to his scheduled appearance at DJF, Detroit-born pianist Johnny O'Neill took to social media to air personal grievances with Collins. "What's up, Detroit? My hometown. I'm so excited to return for the Detroit International Jazz Festival this Sunday. The last time I played the festival was 2017, which is around the time Chris Collins took over. That was the only performance he ever gave me. My manager and I have submitted different themes and ideas over the years, and he wouldn't even send a response, which was very hurtful to me, coming from my hometown." While O'Neill's post might come across as a disgruntled artist publicly airing personal grievances, the statement resonated on Facebook. Commenters responded with affirmations like, "Truth be told, amen," and "Detroit's Jazz Festival is forgetting its mission." Similar sentiments have circulated within the local jazz community for Collins' entire tenure, and even before he took the reins. The question of whether or not the event is the Detroit Jazz Festival or just a jazz festival in Detroit points to the diverging interests of various stakeholders in the festival and the local jazz scene. This paper centers the perspectives of Detroit-based musicians, some who've played DJF dozens of times, and others who have only recently started to headline the festival. I've kept some identities anonymous to protect relationships with the festival, and in other cases, I've cited musicians with permission. In addition to interviews, I draw on social media posts, festival programs, local press coverage, and observations of the 2023 festival. I've regularly attended DJF for over 20 years and have performed on multiple occasions. I've participated in the Detroit jazz community for 2 decades as a professional musician and student of music, but I am not a Detroiter. This research is part of a much larger project which asks how Detroit musicians keep place through both grassroots cultural work and musical performance. Drawing on Alex Bluebee's writing on Detroit hip-hop, I argue that DJF performances by local musicians can enact the Black spatial imaginary, a concept brought forth by sociologist George Lipsitz. Applying this theory is not without complication. The majority of the musicians that I interviewed are Black, but the voices of white musicians are also included, suggesting that the Black spatial imaginary might be enacted through Black performance practice, even in interracial contexts. After attending in 2009, musicologist Anne DeVinge extolled the ways the Detroit Jazz Festival temporarily transforms urban space, activates memories of Detroit's musical roots, and generates positive feelings of community and place. But these ephemeral utopian ideals mask deeper socio-political tensions. The idea of Renaissance pervades Detroit discourse, but remains out of reach for many residents. Debates around corporate interests versus community interests, downtown versus neighborhood investment, and extraction of cultural resources are articulated by historian Heather Townsend's question, who's Detroit? In this paper, I ask, who's festival? To show how these questions of race and place are reflected in the Detroit Jazz Festival. The trope of Detroit's Renaissance emerged in cultural discourse after the 1967 uprising. In 1971, a group of corporate executives under the leadership of Henry Ford II teamed up to create the Detroit Renaissance Foundation. This public-private partnership focused on development projects, most notably the construction of the Renaissance Center, there, along the riverfront. These execs also turned their attention to the convention and tourism industries, including events like the 1980 Republican National Convention, the Formula One Detroit Grand Prix, and the Montreux Detroit International Jazz Festival. The Jazz Festival was conceived when Henry Ford Community College band director Don Lupp received funding to take two groups to the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. When Lupp and Montreux founder Claude Nobbs proposed a sister city alliance between Detroit and Montreux, Mayor Coleman Young appointed Detroit Renaissance Foundation President Robert McCabe as the festival's founding director. The Detroit Jazz Festival has been financially and programmatically managed by multiple entities since that time, but McCabe's original vision for a free admission annual jazz festival in Hurt Plaza remains. Today it operates with a $4 million budget, featuring 4 stages of music over 4 days every Labor Day weekend. The promise of the Detroit Jazz Festival. Since its inception, the Detroit Jazz Festival has represented both real and imagined opportunities for Detroit-based musicians to display artistic skills on a large hometown stage. From the outset, local musicians sought out slots on the festival as means of career advancement to display their virtuosity next to national headliners and to cement the legacy of Detroit jazz. It became a local tradition that offered all of the hallmarks of festivalization, as described by Alessandro Falassi and Victor Turner, time out of time, ritual, and communitas. Describing his experiences participating in the Montreux Detroit Jazz Festival in the 1990s, trombonist Vincent Chandler says, "That was a beautiful thing. We were rehearsing in people's homes, preparing to play this festival. All of my family members, all of my friends would ask, what time are you going to be on?" He recounts the tremendous excitement and the ritual of getting dressed up to go from stage to see peers shining. Several musicians I interviewed noted that in the first 2 decades, the festival felt like the highlight of the year. In a 1990 Detroit Free Press interview, pianist Gary Shunk is quoted saying, "It's the only time of year when we all go nuts. The level of anticipation is high." Today, this can be seen in the proliferation of social media posts backstage during the Jazz Festival. Hashtag Detroit Jazz. Musicians are also optimistic about the impact of the Detroit Jazz Festival on youth, who have opportunities to perform with high school and college ensembles and occasionally rub elbows with their idols at festival jam sessions. Pianist Michael Malice describes it as a rite of passage, explaining that performing for the first time at the DJF felt like a coming-of-age moment. In the past decade, the festival has expanded year-round educational programming in schools, nurturing young Detroiters like trumpeter Trunino Lowe. Lowe, now 25, got his first shot performing as a band leader at the 2023 festival. On a sweltering hot Saturday afternoon, his quartet took to the main stage, launched into an up-tempo swing tune before deftly segueing into a more modern original composition with backbeat. Lowe finally stepped to the mic, sporting a black bucket hat and t-shirt with a graffiti-style pink Detroit across the front. "I'm at the crib, y'all. Wow, this is happening right now." He paused for a moment, unable to speak, as he became visually emotional, tearing up, and garnering shouts of affirmation from the crowd. When I asked Trunino about that moment a few weeks later, he said, "I started crying. That was a dream come true." Older musicians applaud the opportunities afforded by DJF to the next generation, but express frustration at the marginalization of established Detroit-based artists. An elder in the community explains that pay for local musicians is capped, even when they're well-known artists who perform nationally and internationally. He says, "It's really for kids. He can hire some names from New York, he being Chris Collins, to draw attention, but locally, it's all about the kids, which is good. It's putting a cap on the money. He puts a cap on me. I'm not local." A Detroit-based drummer, who also tours internationally, puts it another way. "It's almost like we're punished for staying here." Conversely, young musicians at the early stages of their careers are more willing to accept smaller fees. The two primary concerns I heard from Detroit jazz musicians center on a diminishing number of slots for Detroit-based artists and inequity in the payment structure between local and national acts. According to musician, composer, and band leader Leonard King, this practice is baked into the DNA of the festival. In 1979, he participated on a committee of local musicians and cultural organizers invited to make some recommendations for the inaugural festival. We sat down and really came up with a healthy list of objectives. It wasn't ego-driven or anything like that. When we submitted it to McCabe and his staff, he responded by saying, Detroit area musicians should not be concerned at how much money they are going to make. They should only be concerned about making a contribution to jazz, where we will fill those slots with high school and college bands. Another elder in the community who performed on the inaugural festival affirmed this. Out of town versus in town, it's insulting. And that's been the case since the very beginning. The problem of this hierarchy between local and national acts is not unique to Detroit. In their work on the New Orleans Heritage Festival, Helen Regis and Shana Walton found that the festival structure tells artists implicitly that they are second-rate performers in a festival that books national and international stars. Detroit musicians also remarked that there are fewer and fewer slots on the festival for them. The 2019, 2022, and 2023 festivals featured between 11 and 13 local acts. By contrast, lineups in the 1990s often featured as many as 30 Michigan-based artists, and in the early 2000s featured between 20 and 25 regularly. When I speak with jazz musicians in the Detroit community, the feeling of loss is palpable. A musician who cherished the experience of earlier festivals relates, it's almost like it's not really for us anymore. They call it the Detroit Jazz Festival, but it's not really for us. That a festival of Black American music taking place in a predominantly Black city would be described by a successful local Black musician as not really for us points to broader concerns of inclusion and control of cultural resources in a rapidly gentrifying city. Musicians' feelings about the Detroit Jazz Festival parallel conversations stemming from the exclusion of longtime Detroit residents from the city's current neoliberal renaissance. Between 1970 and 1980, Detroit flipped from a majority white city to a majority Black city. By 2000, over 80% of the population was Black, while the suburbs remained majority white. In his monograph, How Racism Takes Place, George Lipsitz explains interconnections among race, place, and power, theorizing a white spatial imaginary built on exclusivity and augmented exchange value, resulting in diminished opportunities for people of color to accumulate assets that appreciate in value. In Detroit, this manifested in white flight, driven by overtly racist and segregationist housing policies engendered in this white spatial imaginary. In fact, the narrative of white flight functioned alongside the media's insistence on painting Detroit as a wasteland of urban decay, awaiting its moment of renaissance. In her work on journalistic discourse of Detroit, Siobhan Gregory writes that the concept of white flight reinforces a narrative that when whites leave cities or neighborhoods, they somehow fall apart, and that rebirth and renewal are dependent on whites returning. The Detroit Jazz Festival was built on a corporate-driven concept of renaissance that implicitly sought to bring whiteness back to Detroit through tourism and commerce, ironically through the commoditization of Black cultural production. Musician Leonard King, cited earlier, sees a direct correlation between demographic shifts, neoliberal Renaissance policy, and the corporatization and institutionalization of jazz. King states that the collapse of the cities and the neighborhoods allowed that corporate takeover. People weren't at the forefront of presenting cultural events anymore. He argues that the shift from neighborhood-based musicking to corporate-funded festivals resulted in a less inclusive cultural practice. He explains, the community aspect is inclusive. You had to be able to play, and you had to be a good human being. The corporate aspect is exclusive. We want you, but we don't want you. King's theorizing aligns with Lipsitz. While the white spatial imaginary represents spaces of exclusion and gatekeeping, Lipsitz posits the Black spatial imaginary as its obverse, a community-building site of inclusion and solidarity. Following Detroit's municipal bankruptcy in 2013, the trope of the city's rebirth came back with a vengeance. But the press also told the tale of two Detroits, generous public subsidies for downtown development in stark contrast with infrastructure-neglected neighborhoods. Developers, entrepreneurs, and young white artists embraced the blank slate metaphor, marking the symbolic erasure of Black Detroiters who lived in the city all along. Richard Florida has spelled out the way gentrification takes hold in neighborhoods. Inexpensive properties lure the creative class, followed by the upper middle class. A local pianist explained to me how she was losing her apartment in Southwest Detroit because the building's owner had decided to cash in on rising real estate values. After mentioning another musician who lost his apartment in the Eastern Market neighborhood, she lamented, "It's like those of us who stayed here and kept the culture don't even matter." Guitarist Ron English recalls the 1980s as dark times, when neighborhood clubs closed, session work evaporated, and gigs moved to racially segregated suburbs. He says, "I really respected the guys like Harold McKinney and Marcus Belgrave who were able to grind it out." These lived experiences help frame the sense of loss expressed by this generation of musicians, nostalgic for Detroit Jazz Festival, in which lineups featured dozens of locally based artists, and Detroit musicians headlined alongside national acts. Those festivals mark the culmination of hard work and sticking it through tough times in the city. The anxieties over diminishing returns for Detroit musicians from the DJF mirrors the actual experience of being priced out of neighborhoods, seen now as a blank slate for newcomers and developers. Several musicians I talked to pointed to the fact that the Detroit Jazz Festival trades in the cultural currency that Detroit jazz musicians create throughout the year. The festival touts Detroit as a jazz city and emphasizes Detroit jazz history in marketing materials and even in its mission statement. For over 40 years, the Detroit Jazz Festival Foundation has celebrated Detroit's rich history of jazz music. One musician reflected on this aspect, asking, "What does it mean to be a Detroit musician? Is it someone who's from here but doesn't live here anymore, who has a national profile, or is it someone who holds down the fort while those people are away?" They suggest that the DJF might be better served as an opportunity to honor and respect the musicians who carry the torch in Detroit, because the festival does so much trading on their name. Despite their critiques, Detroit musicians still value the festival and use performances to sonically assert their rightful place in the lineup. Both longtime culture bearers and upcoming generations show a commitment to performing their Detroit lineage. During a set by the Balance Duo, Malice and saxophonist Marcus Elliott made a point of calling in the ancestors through performances of two Detroit standards, including Marcus Belgrave's All My Love and the Lawrence Williams composition number 4. I'm just gonna play a little, you've been listening to me talk, and I get to hear a little bit of something.
I want to dedicate this set to all of our teachers, to all the musicians that came before us, to all the people who paved the way to make this happen, and in particular to our teachers who are from the city of Detroit, for really showing us not just how to play music, but how to be good human beings. So thank you to all of them who are with us and who are no longer with us.
I want to dedicate this to some other people. I want to dedicate this to all of our students.
That's right.
We have a lot of students in the house as well.
That's
One right there, one over there. So we're dedicating this to the past as well as the future.
I love that.
We like to play original music in this ensemble, but another thing that we really like to do is play music from our home, especially music from our mentors. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here. We're going to play a song by the great Marcus Belgrave, who we were fortunate enough to work with.
I can play that whole track. So when I asked Malice to reflect on this moment, he said, "I think it feels really good to call your ancestors into the room when you're making music like this. It's not an individual pursuit, what we're doing. It's not even close to that. The band is a community, and that community exists within a community of musicians, which exists within a community of music makers and listeners, which exists within a multi-generational human and ghost community of all the people who have made music ever. The duo's commitment to calling in ancestors and future generations embodies Leonard King's vision of inclusivity and community-based practices. The Black Spatial Imaginary is a community building site of imagination, potential, and possibility, and Black cultural production is a method of taking place. In the face of the perceived marginalization by the Detroit Jazz Festival and actual displacement and erasure as a result of gentrification, Detroit musicians regularly re-emplace the local community and the Detroit jazz lineage in these festival performances. The idea of Renaissance has been inherent to the Jazz Festival since its inception, from the dark times of the 1980s to present-day rebirth and subsequent gentrification. The DJF shows us how the racialized geography of Detroit structures its institutions, its cultural productions, and the everyday experiences of musicians living in the city. The current DJF leadership expresses a sincere desire to honor the legacy of Detroit jazz and foster future generations, all while balancing the fiscal realities of sustaining a jazz festival. Still, many longtime culture bearers, those who carried the torch in the toughest times, feel like the festival isn't for them any longer. The damage isn't irreparable should the DJF leadership feel compelled to address these concerns. An email to Johnny O'Neill might be a good place to start. That's where I'll end. Only I'm also going to give you guys a list of all the jazz that you should see this week. And QR code, it takes you to a Google School page. So that's the INGRID curated list.
Thank you.
Are we going to do questions at the very end?
We'll do questions as we roll.
Okay.
So we need to pop in and out. But if you have questions, pass the microphone around to you. Good time for a few before we get on, guys. And in the interest of community building, I'd love it if everyone could introduce themselves to the room as well. Thank you.
Ken Brody from Michigan State. Love the paper, been to DJF many, many times. I'm wondering if has the DJF or the city ever done any kind of study or survey in terms of the audience, who's coming, how many, I mean, I know it's probably really hard on a non-ticketed event where people just show up, but
Yeah.
is there a sense of like how many people come from outside Detroit versus how many people come in?
That's a really good question. So, the bigger project will also include like reception and programming. This was like very much the musician-centered perspective. I haven't been able to get a meeting with Chris Collins yet, but I do have some friends who work for the organization, and so that's like on the list of understanding the reception a little bit better. I will say one thing that I didn't squeeze into the paper that I thought was really interesting, of course, is we have VIP badges now. And what's happening with the VIP seating is that you have like a football field of empty seats during the day between the stage and the people, right? Which is a very interesting dynamic because people the VIP folks really come like for the headliners late at night, and so like it fills up when Kenny Garrett's playing, but at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when Trimino's playing, it's like, there's like all these empty seats.
Yeah, it does look very
It's a very,
It really does.
it's a very strange spatial experience.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Scott DeVoe from the University of Virginia. Thank you very much for this informative paper. It's intriguing to see how in the 80s and 90s it seemed to be deliberately focusing on community building, which strikes me as unusual for a jazz festival. I mean, are there other cities that do that?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things, so Michael Alamana just wrote a really great paper about the Chicago Jazz Festival, where he sort of uncovers the programming side, and what happens there is they program by committee at the Chicago Jazz Festival. They still have, I'm trying to remember the percentage, something like 70%, 30%, 70% Chicago musicians, 30% like international headliners. The Detroit Jazz Festival in the 80s and 90s was programmed by committee. So there's a pianist named Ken Cox who was very involved in the committee in the earlier years. So you have to sort of like wonder if part of that shift is about how it's being programmed. Now it's strictly, it's a hierarchy.
From the top down.
It's very top down, yeah. And it's not transparent. They make it look transparent. Actually, they just posted this very lovely page explaining how you can apply and be in the Detroit Jazz Festival. Yeah, but it's not transparent.
We've got time for one more question. Anyone has one?
Mark at the University of Michigan. Thanks, Ingrid. Great paper. I'm wondering if you could talk about that moment between Michael and, the sort of, I just wonder if you could talk about the kind of affective kind of work that took place both between them and the audience there.
And the audience,
Yeah, like the calling in of ancestors and of students, what sort of, you think about this spatial kind of metaphor that you're using that includes the festival as a geographically localized space, but there's also kind of a performance space, just inviting you to elaborate a bit on that kind of how you're thinking about that moment.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment because the crowds at the festival, and you could speak to this too, are very, like, Detroiters are like there for you, right? And so there is this, like, when you make a call out like that, it's like palpable. People are like with you, and so it does feel like you are creating this space of a very and you know this, that I'm thinking a lot about sort of the structure of feeling that I think is enacted in those performances. And so the structure of feeling that I'm thinking about, and this is like long-term project, is because, like, can you say Detroitness is a structure of feeling, but there's a structure of feeling that feels like it's a grit and sort of a continued resilience. And that one is very much in its infancy, but that structure of feeling, I think, is called to the stage when people make these sort of, like, we're calling in the ancestors, I'm gonna cite Marcus Belgrade, it's like, it could feel very name droppy, but it's not. It's completely like, this is our family, and we're bringing the family to the stage now, so.
Okay, thank you so much. Our next speaker this morning is Jacob Collins, who is a PhD candidate in musicology and teaching assistant at the University of North Texas. He holds a bachelor's degree in music education and a master's degree in musicology from Texas Christian University. Collins' primary research area is jazz and popular music, but he also studies jazz in video games. He has a chapter in the upcoming Oxford Handbook of Video Game Music entitled Game Noir: The Functions of Jazz in the Detective Adventure Video Game. His dissertation is about the intersections of jazz and popular music as it relates to jazz historiography. He's primarily concerned with studying the variety of jazz expression outside common narratives used to tell jazz history. Collins won the Hewitt Overdofer Award for the Best Student Submission from the American Musicological Society Southwest Chapter, and is presented at their regional conference. Outside of musicology, Collins loves to garden and play video games. The title of his talk today is Snarky Puppy and Post-Fusion Jazz. Please join me in welcoming Jacob.
Can you hear me okay? Cool, awesome. Despite producing albums since 2006, Snarky Puppy remained relatively obscure until they won the Grammy for the Best R&B Song in 2014 for Something featuring Layla Hathaway, and yes, the daughter of Donny Hathaway. Since then, the group has accumulated many other accolades, including titles such as Favorite Jazz Group from Downbeat and Best Electric Fusion Contemporary Group Artist from Jazz Times. Since their first Grammy, Snarky Puppy has won 4 more, all for Best Contemporary Instrumental Album. Although Snarky Puppy's success is now undeniable, these various accolades highlight a general disagreement over how exactly the band should be categorized. This ambiguity is partly attributable to the band's spokesman and leader, bassist Michael Lee, who along with his other bandmates create music that draws from eclectic genres without ever firmly settling in one. In interviews, such as a 2016 interview with critic Nate Chinan, Lee seems to resist categorization, distinguishing himself from his, quote, white jazz school, unquote, experience at the University of North Texas. If pressed, Lee sometimes refers to the group as instrumental pop, but it is clear that he would rather not place any label on the group at all. And there are some other buzzwords here that often appear whenever Snarky Puppy is being discussed, instrumental pop, UNT oldest jazz program in the country. That League and some of his other members had mentored by these sort of crossover R&B solo artists, particularly in the church scene outside of Dallas. Those are all very common tropes. Even further obscuring their categorizations are the interviews on the DVD portion of Snarky Puppy's 2014 album, We Like It Here, in which several members describe the band's musical style by simply stating a variation of, quote, "we just make the music we want to," end quote. All of these instances reveal a complicated sense of identity that hovers somewhere around jazz, but perhaps does not sit comfortably in jazz. In this paper, I argue that Snarky Puppy represents a contemporary type of jazz that I term post-fusion. Post-fusion bands share many of 1970s jazz fusion musical characteristics, including expanded instrumentation and timbres, technical emphasis on technical virtuosity, episodic forms, and rhythmic complexity. However, their wider incorporation of diverse musical styles, such as various kinds of pop, soul, gospel, and others previously excluded from fusion discourse, their ability to emphasize musical characteristics beyond virtuosity, and their ambivalence towards being categorized stylistically ultimately sets them apart from their predecessors. Building on the work of Kevin Fellis, Stephen Pond, and John Kovach, I first contextualized Snarky Puppy's relationship to 1970s jazz fusion, highlighting their stylistic similarities that the group shares with early fusion groups. Then, using their 2014 album, We Like It Here, I demonstrate how the group has adopted a more modern approach that significantly diverges from this lineage. Ultimately, I suggest that post-fusion is a useful framework for understanding how many musicians experience and conceive of jazz in the 21st century. In the wake of Miles Davis's 1970 album, Bitches Brew, the widely accepted progenitor of jazz fusion that makes rock music with jazz improvisation, jazz musicians and groups began to experiment with their own hybrid styles. Soon, they established jazz fusion as a site of transgenic space that simultaneously bore the musical markers of jazz, rock, and funk, while being none of these things wholly. Kevin Fellis, following Isabel Armstrong, therefore describes fusion bands as occupying a broken middle where they explored the, quote, liminal spaces between genres, end quote, without firmly settling in one. And to make this graphic a little more accurate, imagine that there's separated between there. I couldn't quite exactly make that how I wanted to, but just imagine that there's a little bit of separation between fusion in the middle there. This melding of jazz, rock, and funk was accompanied by other experiments, such as Herbie Hancock's application of African drums and sounds, Return to Forever's use of Latin-based instrumentation and grooves, and Mahavishnu's orchestra's Indian classical music influence. Nonetheless, fusion's core centered around the mixing of jazz, rock, and funk. Although it is largely an amorphous genre, scholars have identified multiple musical characteristics common to 1970 jazz fusion that represents it as an outgrowth of the jazz combo featuring mostly acoustic instruments. Scott DeVoe, for instance, describes fusion groups as electric instruments, modern production techniques, and funk or rock-oriented feeling. Fellis supplements this list adding extended solo improvisations, complex non-stroking forms, and an emphasis on technical rather than expressive performance styles. Pond similarly notes that one of the key elements of jazz fusions was its expanded timbral possibilities, which included amplified instruments such as the electric guitar and electric bass, synthesizers, and non-Western instruments. Each of these short lists demonstrate a set of values rather than a hard and fast list. Likewise, the characteristics of 1970s fusion I highlight are not rigid rules, but rather a set of characteristics that demonstrate similar stylistic values. Hopefully, by the bolded parts, you can see kind of where I derive my different categories in my research. First one, Snarky Puppy's instrumentation centers around the template established by early jazz fusion groups, which is largely that of a 1970s rock band, with drums, electric bass, electric guitar, synthesizers, etc., with some horns, and builds on the timbral experimentation of including electronic instruments, a move which upset jazz purists in the 70s when groups first adopted it. While it may vary from album to album, Snarky Puppy in general has this core ensemble, which, except for the bass guitar, at least doubles the number of members on each of these core instruments. While the group's expanded instrumentation becomes relevant later, each of these instruments largely fit within the categories established by early fusion groups. The latter three characteristics that both Snarky Puppy and early 1970s fusion exhibit, virtuosity, episodic forms, rhythmic complexity, fit neatly together and often assist each other in producing technically complex beats. Fellis describes virtuosity as the most significant feature of 70s jazz fusion, as the melding of jazz and rock codes created new opportunities for musicians to demonstrate their individual skills as soloists. In the case of Snarky Puppy, any of these technically demanding solos on the album, such as Corey Henry's solo from Lingus, satisfies this criterion But the key to jazz fusion is how they utilize other stylistic markers from other genres to emphasize this virtuosity. One example is the departure from the head solo's head form common to jazz combos in favor of episodic song forms, which have distinct sections that may or may not have returning melodic or harmonic material. These forms demonstrate the musician's compositional skills and virtuosic technical ability, and as John Kovacs argues, were largely borrowed from the progressive rock genre alongside a reliance on polyrhythms, rapidly shifting sections, or odd or complex time signatures. By utilizing an episodic form full of contrasting, highly composed sections, Snarky Puppy highlights the virtuosity of various musicians by emphasizing different soloists and groups of instruments in each section. Many of the tracks on We Like It Here exhibit a reliance on these forms, but one of their most popular tunes, Shofukan, provides the clearest example of how these forms function. This song overall is a medium tempo and in 4/4 time, builds intensity over the course of the song through increased dynamics and an increasing reliance on complexity and virtuosity. As each section progresses, the group sometimes reincorporates previous melodic material, but it never resembles a head solo head form as one might find in a jazz combo. And I won't have time to play this for you because I have to play the whole thing, so feel free to take a picture and tell me if you agree or disagree. Like early fusion group, Snarky Puppy's use of these forms allow each section of the band, whether it is the horns, strings, guitar, synthesizers, etc., to demonstrate their technical abilities. The best example of rhythmic complexity is the hemiola patterns in What About Me. The resulting texture is a complex polyrhythmic feel in which two separate choirs of instruments play different riffs, almost but not quite lining up on hypermetrically strong beats. This gives the sensation of a rhythmic displacement as the initial note of the pattern starts on a downbeat. It frequently recurs on the 16th note before the downbeat. We'll see if I can get this done. Let's see, I might be. And then, of course, devolves or goes into a really insanely cool drum solo after this. So, post-fusion, musicians need a large amount of technical skill to maintain this pattern, which aids in portraying virtuosity. As this example demonstrates, Snarky Puppy uses techniques that were popularized in early jazz fusion to demonstrate similar aesthetic values. Post-fusion is, in many ways, in dialogue with 1970s jazz fusion, although it departs from many key areas. Notably, its more diverse styles it incorporates from, the instrumental timbres they borrow, and the specific musical characteristics beyond virtuosity they emphasize, and an ambivalence towards being categorized stylistically. In addition to fusion's use of funk and rock, post-fusion adds even more genres to the mix, including hip-hop, Latin, neo-soul, acid jazz, punk, grunge, etc., all while always incorporating jazz elements. This in turn leads to the adoption of an even wider range of instruments and timbres. This range in the incorporation of various electric and acoustic instruments invokes the aesthetic of the styles from which they borrow. The extended ensemble shown on this slide has a group of instruments which resemble the rock ensemble I mentioned previously, but as you can see, many additional instruments of those same types, in addition to other types not common in early fusion, such as a string quartet, a grand piano. Aside from this, an acoustic piano, which is relevant below. Aside from this, a large portion of this instrumentation and timbral influence comes from Black American music, according to Lee. For example, in the track Sleeper, Sean Martin uses a talk box to wordlessly voice his keyboard through a plastic tube, channeling its sound into his mouth and then a microphone. The image Martin evokes is akin to perhaps a Roger Troutman of Zapp and early hip-hop with its vocalization paired with fast bebop-inspired lyrics during a solo. While conscious awareness of this connection is not necessarily important, Martin's performance evokes the same timbral associations of excitement and novelty that comes with the talk box in a black rock music setting. Contrary to Fellis' description of 1970s jazz fusion bands as emphasizing, quote, technical rather than expressive performance styles, end quote, post-fusion groups can and do emphasize expressivity by, at times, incorporating different conceptual approaches. In other words, post-fusion groups highlight a variety of affects, such as introspection or contemplation, whereas 1970s fusion groups almost exclusively relied on portraying an excited affect. Early fusion groups favored up-tempo songs with complex formal structures and technically virtuosic performances. Post-fusion groups are far more comfortable utilizing slower tempos, simpler song forms, or quieter dynamics, often as a way of fostering an expressive intimacy with their audiences. This means that post-fusion groups often write and perform tunes that sound almost completely like other genres, such as the aforementioned soul, gospel, or R&B, giving them, in some senses, an even greater range of potential expression. Think back to the R&B Grammy that Snarky Puppy won for Something, featuring Layla Hathaway. On this album, however, Kite best exemplifies the practice by using sonic markers of classical music, which 1970s fusion did not do. Featuring almost no technically demanding passages, Kite treats the ensemble almost like an orchestra, in that each instrument group, horns, keyboards, etc., work together, much like the sections do in a symphony. The focal point of the piece is Bill Lawrence on acoustic piano, the only time such an instrument is used on the album. The emphasis is mirrored both literally, as the piano is the center of the ensemble, and sonically, as the piano is mixed in such a way that other instruments fit inside it acoustically. The strings and orchestra-like arrangement conjure images of many works by contemporary jazz big band leaders such as Maria Schneider, perhaps calling to other innovations present in other areas of today's jazz landscape. I wish I could play more of that. It's a very, very great song. The use of acoustic piano is significant here, as its utilization, along with the string quartet, break aesthetic codes and inverts anxieties associated with early jazz fusion. While incorporating electronic timbres was an anxiety for early fusion groups, Snarky Puppy has no problem doing so, and instead their incorporation of acoustic instruments is now the new and innovative decision within an electronic-heavy ensemble. What this shows that Snarky Puppy's values are not necessarily the same as early jazz fusions in all cases. They often emphasize virtuosity and stylistic hybridity, but they also take pleasure in briefly resting within singular genres. This is perhaps why the band members themselves have difficulty categorizing the music. They simply want to play music without any of the conceptual struggles that early jazz fusion had to deal with. In fact, it seems that the critics want and need the popularity and mainstream success that Snarky Puppy brings to the jazz world. Finally, this ambivalence towards categorization is an essential part of Snarky Puppy's identity. Authors such as Pond demonstrate, for example, the struggles that Hancock had marketing his 1973 album Headhunters, all while attempting to navigate the fine line of serious jazz and commercial pandering, with accusations of the latter coming from critics and fans alike. However, the critical response for post-fusion is overwhelmingly positive, but Snarky Puppy could not seem to care less. Typically, critics embrace Snarky Puppy for their expanded eclectic taste. Kevin McCulloch praises the group's wide stylistic variety from jazz, funk, R&B, and gospel to influences by Bjork and Radiohead. Mike Flynn offers a similar view, likening the groups to bands like Tower Power or Weather Report, but distinctly for our current generation. China, in his review at the beginning of this article, settles on the same positive conclusion that League resists labeling, comparing Snarky Puppy to an eclectic coalition. Revisiting League's statements at the beginning of this presentation show League's hesitation to accept any label. When I recently spoke with League at UNT, I asked him about these publications giving them various jazz accolades, and he candidly admits that they're not jazz, pointing to their Grammy for Something and asserting the group wrote it as an R&B tune. While this aligns with League's other statements throughout the years, it is important to note that this discussion between the two of us took place immediately after he sat in and directed UNT Jazz's famous 1 O'Clock Lab Band, with which he performed later that night. Even if League tries to exist outside the boundaries of jazz, it seems almost like an open secret that Snarky Puppy exists in jazz spaces. I'm not the first to identify populist trends in 21st century jazz. For example, in 2022, critic Nate Chinen wrote an NPR article exploring a tweet by the composer-pianist B.J. Iyer that stated, quote, latest subgenre, viral jazz, and then in parentheses, I don't think the term exists, but the music definitely does, end quote. While Iyer offered no context to his statement, Chinen interprets it to refer to hyper-popular groups that could vaguely be considered a new style of jazz, such as Gomi and J.D. Beck, Mono Neon, Louis Cole, Jacob Collier, among others. To China, viral jazz is more of an aesthetic than a subgenre. Yes, viral jazz infuses jazz elements with popular music, but to be viral jazz, the music must have a certain popular look. It needs to be trending on YouTube or on TikTok, much like a viral video. China is correct in pointing out that these musicians draw on jazz elements and are popular among a large portion of a young audience. But using the term viral would be misleading or unhelpful. When China uses viral to evoke things like being popular on the internet or to have a trendy aesthetic, it invokes the other colloquial meaning of the term, temporary. Even though China recognizes there's more of this kind of music to come, he still treats it as jazz adjacent. None of this is cause for hand-wringing, contrary to some of the framing you may have seen, like that headline from the Times Magazine piece, "Who are these kids and what are they doing to jazz?" That's referring to Donnie and J.D. Beck. Viral jazz means no harm to the host organism. It will keep mutating according to its own capricious logic. Students at conservatories like Berkeley are presently poring over YouTube clips of Donnie and J.D. Beck, Louis Cole, and others with Talmudic intensity, so it seems likely we'll be seeing even more along these lines. But as we've witnessed countless times over the last century, the tradition of improvised music is resilient and adaptive. Viral jazz isn't the only sort of jazz built for change. This use of capricious implies that these changes are sudden and cannot be accounted for. This is simply untrue. As I've shown, post-fusion represents a logical trajectory, even if the bands no longer exactly resemble their predecessors. More troubling, though, is framing viral jazz as something feeding off the host organism. Doing so denies the agency of these musicians who clearly operate within the jazz frame while also adding to it. If anything, it would seem this relationship is the opposite, as mainstream jazz institutions now regularly invoke post-fusion's popularity as a positive trend in jazz. It therefore seems increasingly obvious that post-fusion musicians should be taken seriously in their own right, especially if their approach is becoming a dominant part of contemporary jazz. Ultimately, post-fusion best explains what today's jazz musicians are already doing. When Snarky Puppy rejects the jazz label, they are not denying its influence on their music, they are denying the restrictions of the label. By freely borrowing from other genres, timbres, and instruments, they mix according to their own musical tastes that have been informed by jazz, but also many other forms of music. Post-fusion groups reveal that perhaps the spirit of early jazz fusion had merit all along, and the musical styles and aestheticals brought into jazz from other popular genres are not depurifying jazz, but are instead revitalizing it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Questions?
Hi, Jacob. Great. I really enjoyed that. You kind of anticipated the question I was going to ask when you started talking about interviewing Michael Lee at North Texas as he was about to go in and get direct. And full disclosure, I'm also a graduate of that program, so you don't have any here. But there does seem to be kind of a sense of wanting to have it both ways, right? Because I know when I play Snarky Puppy for my students at Michigan State in the jazz history class, and actually to circle back to INGRID paper, many of whom are from Detroit, by the way. One of the first things they say is, it sounds like a band of North Texas plays. And whether they do or not, I kind of don't think it's the point, but that reputation follows the program. It's like they'll hear the more introspective stuff, and then Leonard Lewis lays down some ridiculous virtuosic thing, and that's where their attention goes. Can they escape this? Can Michael Lee keep that program and keep that sort of identification with jazz at arm's length, or do you think it's always kind of catch up?
That's a great question. I think, one, just to put that out there first, I don't really think Lee or the band tries that hard to resist it. They say they do, but they kind of wear the North Texas badge on their sleeve, especially if you look at their website and stuff. I think they could if they tried hard enough, but also I still think that that's going to be, especially with how UNT treats them now, as like, oh, the former students of the UNT jazz program, that's always going to be kind of chasing them a little bit. If I were to say a group that would be maybe a model, some of the other groups that I mentioned, like Louis Cole or even Mono Neon, they also come from like, because Louis Cole I think is USC Morton, I think, and then YouTubers like Adam Neely come from Berkeley, but they kind of don't have that same stigma. So, but then again, you could argue that those programs don't have the exact same North Texas reputation. But I think there's a world in which they could, but I don't think they try that hard, and I think it still benefits them in some way to have this kind of, we can be whatever we want to be kind of attitude.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we can talk
Yeah.
a lot more.
And I'm sure we will, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Scott DeVoe from University of Virginia. It's intriguing to think about your term post-fusion. It's assuming that fusion comes first, defines a genre, and then that they're rebelling from that. One thing that I try to think about in doing jazz history is trying to think from the present and then go backwards. I mean, fusion was kind of an odd label to assert a kind of a genre that I think the record companies at that time were hoping was going to be a separate genre, a separate place for people in record stores to look for a particular thing. They wouldn't look in jazz, they wouldn't look in rock, they would look for fusion. And you know, that was an attempt that was tried really in the 1970s, and essentially it got wiped out by things like smooth jazz and other ways that the industry had of reorganizing itself around a more clearly commercial product. So I don't know. Fusion is a helpful general tool. You know, in my textbook, I extended back into the 50s and 60s, actually really more reclaiming the 50s for trying to think about how jazz is simultaneously pursuing its career with fabulous instrumental musicians, but also trying to deal with a mass audience at the same time. So that, you know, that's a place in my textbook where I talk about Frank Sinatra, for example, whose absence from jazz history textbooks has always struck me as remarkable, considering how important he was and how strongly influenced he was by jazz styles. But, you know, he's not Mingus, he's not Miles, he's not any of those people. You just kind of drop the whole pop thing once that takes place. This is instrumental music primarily. I mean, yes, right. I mean, that sort of is the initial problem of where do you fit it in? Because obviously, if it had a singer, it would be easier to categorize according to whatever kind of genre it happens to fall into. I do think that education is really crucial here. Obviously, I mean, you know, you just had a discussion about North Texas. I mean, that whole thing about, you know, yes, it's a nerdy program and we're doing something more hip. Obviously, that is feeding back into what North Texas students are thinking, or as you said, the Talmudic intensity with which they're looking at Domi and J.D. Beck is, again, just like they're doing something different. I want to catch on to that. I don't know exactly what to call it. I mean, this whole idea of viral jazz is sort of saying it's based on the internet, which is an interesting way of thinking about it, but that's sort of saying what is the current means of distribution and production, how is that affecting the way the music is organized? And I frankly don't have an answer to that, just as, you know, the new instruments and the new things that you're sort of describing they're doing are, you know, they're all fascinating, but again, it's just technology in charge. And I just think, I guess this isn't really a question so much as a rant, but I'm just saying that you should be thinking about it, things from the present and just trying to figure out what's going on. And then we can recast 70s fusion however we want. We don't have to think of it as sort of occupying a space that, you know, has to be, I mean, obviously a lot of jazz history textbooks had a whole chapter on 70s fusion because that was the current thing at the time they were initially written. But, you know, these days, I don't know. It kind of feels like an odd moment in jazz history. And what you're describing is more the result of what happens when schools like North Texas and Berkeley are just cranking out fabulous musicians all the time. And, you know, and whatever they end up doing is going to be what jazz ends up being. Sorry for the rant. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I've been wrestling with a lot of your works for a while, so I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker this morning is Samuel Parker, who is an assistant professor of music history at Baylor University, where he teaches courses on 20th and 21st century classical and popular music genres. He is currently completing a book manuscript entitled Hillbillies and Mountain Williams, Race and Respectability in Early Country Music Media. He has previously published on the topic of race and country music in jams, and his article on Garth Brooks covers and internet disinformation is forthcoming in the Journal of Musicology in fall 2024. His talk today is titled Jazz Historiography and Western Swing. Please join me in welcoming Samuel.
Thanks for being here, everyone. I guess I want to give a moment of full disclosure. I'm very much a country music scholar. Excited to be on the jazz panel. Please tell me what I'm missing, what I got wrong. I appreciate the feedback, so thank you. Growing up in Oklahoma in the 1930s, country guitarist Johnny Bond listened to the radio constantly, splitting his time between mainstream jazz musicians and regional white Texas groups like the Light Crust Doughboys. Along with ensembles like Milton Brown and his Musical Brownies and Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, the Doughboys specialized in swing rhythms and improvised choruses played on string instruments, a subgenre now dubbed Western Swing. And just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to play a clip of the Doughboys playing Tiger Rag. And hopefully it will blend. Big enough there. I'm not sure how much of that you're actually able to hear. Yeah, we might. It's just such wonderful music. I want to make sure we get it. Okay, yeah. My voice sounds louder. Okay, let's try it again. Let's try it again. Okay. Oh, yeah, it's much louder now. Okay, I'll stand over here. All right. So despite Western Swing's jazz connections, record companies routinely advertised it as quote-unquote hillbilly music, following a racialized marketing logic that Carl Hexter Miller has called the musical color line. Thus, for Johnny Bond, listening to Western Swing was to court social ostracism. He says, "Whenever my classmates learned that I was listening to that hillbilly music, I thought they were going to kick me out of school. My chums dug Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Bing Crosby. And I liked them too, but if they called you a hillbilly, that was a put-down of the worst kind." Like Johnny Bond, Western Swing musicians of the 1930s and 40s shared an affinity for big band swing. Band leaders like Brown and Wills chafed at the hillbilly label as an insult to their musicianship and pointedly described themselves as jazz musicians. Since the 1970s, Western Swing revivalists, dance societies, and historians have followed suit, rejecting the country label in favor of jazz, which they feel affords to Western Swing greater artistic prestige and social respectability. Despite this advocacy, Western Swing has failed to gain much traction within mainstream jazz historiography. This presentation compares efforts to codify Western Swing as jazz against the music's ambivalent reception among jazz journalists and historians. The comparison exposes disagreement over the meaning of the genre and jazz history's larger socio-political frameworks. While both sides agree on jazz's stylistic tenets and artistic cachet, Western Swing contradicts dominant jazz discourses regarding race, class, and region. Contemporary assertions of Western Swing as jazz echo early performers by refuting the working-class stigma attached to country music. Yet these assertions now operate anachronistically, claiming the prestige that jazz has accrued since the 1950s, while ignoring the cultural and racial politics that go with it. At the same time, efforts within jazz historiography to marginalize Western Swing preserve a hard-won aesthetic distinction via occasional recourse to class and regionalist chauvinisms. Western swing musicians' insistence on the jazz label stemmed from a combination of stylistic, professional, and social concerns. Style distinctions and the pride of the virtuoso were prominent factors. Pianist Fred Calhoun of the musical Brownies described the formal approach as, quote, straight melody and harmony on the first chorus. Then Milton would sing it. That defined the tune. And then the rest, of course, were jazz choruses. It was Dixieland on the strings. Marvin Montgomery of the Doughboys concurred. We were learning jazz. We made our own musical sound by replacing big band horn solos with string instruments. Western swing repertory overlapped closely with big band standards, and several musicians demonstrated clear influence from leading jazz figures. Milton Brown frequently mimicked Cab Calloway's Heidi-High vocal scatting. Steel guitarist Bob Dunn copied the glissandi and voice-leading approaches of trombonist Jack Teagarden, and several players cited violinist Joe Venuti and guitarist Eddie Lang as musical heroes. As Western swing reached peak popularity on the West Coast during World War II, ensembles expanded in size to include horns alongside strings, as you see here, strengthening their stylistic overlap with mainstream jazz. During this time, many Western swing musicians disparaged country music as beneath their abilities. Leon McAuliffe of the Texas Playboys claimed the band never studied country musicians because none of them were, quote, near our level at that time. Fiddler Cliff Bruner claimed to have never performed country music his entire life, while Bob Wills often chided journalists, don't call me country. Antipathy toward the country label went beyond mere style preference. In the Southwest, musicians' unions engaged in protectionist measures to limit membership to middle-class musicians, most notably by requiring members to read musical notation. This barred most Western swing and hillbilly musicians from membership. Anecdotally, some applicants were barred even if they met literacy requirement, if they also performed hillbilly or other ostensibly illegitimate music. As Buddy Ray of the Houston-based Village Boys put it, they didn't consider us musicians. We were hillbilly pickers and had old instruments, even though the band was a jazz band. Beyond professional consequences, Western swing musicians objected to the hillbilly label for its negative class implications. As historian Anthony Harkins has argued, white middle-class Americans have long used the hillbilly stereotype as a negative other against which they may demonstrate their presumed social and cultural superiority. The hillbilly gained even greater currency at the turn of the 20th century, where the stereotype proved a useful foil for articulating the benefits and ambivalence of urban industrial modernity. Many Western swing musicians hailed from the rural working class, and thus proved particularly sensitive to the hillbilly epithet. While seldom invoking class politics, their frequent insistence on the jazz label reflected social as well as musical aspirations. Since the 1970s, Western swing audiences and scholars have continued to insist upon a jazz classification. While their stated rationale is grounded in style evidence, artistic prestige and social respectability remain the implicit stakes. Western swing historians developed close relationships with musicians during interviews and adopted their forceful attitudes regarding genre. In the 1976 biography San Antonio Rose, The Life and Music of Bob Wills, Charles R. Townsend repeatedly debunks the notion that Wills was a country musician by emphasizing Wills' affinity for Dixieland jazz and his relationships with black blues and jazz musicians. Gene Boyd, the author of several monographs on Western swing, makes similar claims. In The Jazz of the Southwest from 1998, Boyd explains that, quote, jazz is not a type of music, but rather an approach to making music that involves personal interpretation, improvisation, and a unique rhythmic method. Boyd concludes the book by saying, Western swing was and is jazz, Southwestern jazz, built upon the same principles of improvisation and interpretation that have turned all types of music into jazz. All efforts to classify Western swing as country music will fall short upon further examination. Figures outside of academia echo these perspectives, particularly fan clubs and dance societies. The Western Swing Society, formed in 1981 in Sacramento, identifies its mission as, quote, the preservation and promotion of Western swing music as an American jazz art form. Its advocacy includes hosting dances, providing scholarships to young musicians, and maintaining a Hall of Fame. The Society's monthly newsletters routinely argue for jazz status. Western swing music is a division of the American phenomenon known as jazz. jazz music is typically defined by its use of improvisation. Western swing music relies also on improvisation. Therefore, Western swing music is a form of jazz. While the recourse to style definitions appears to prosecute the case impartially, this rhetoric reflects an abiding investment in artistic and social uplift. Phrases like American jazz art form seek to dignify Western swing through the language of patriotism and a tacit reliance on the cultural cachet that jazz has accumulated since the 1940s. The argument is limited in its depth and its reach. These latter-day advocates seldom engage with jazz's broader socio-historical frameworks, particularly matters of class and race. Moreover, this advocacy has largely failed to achieve Western swing's desired acceptance within the jazz canon, or to rescue it from its associations with country music. Although not entirely absent, Western swing has occupied a marginal position within mainstream jazz journalism and scholarship since the 1940s. Coverage in jazz periodicals reached a peak at mid-century, ranging from critical disdain to measured admiration. But from reviews to features to advertisements, and you have a few examples here, Western swing is almost always pigeonholed as a rural, often comic novelty, distinct from mainstream jazz. A 1953 article by Cliffy Stone in Downbeat acknowledged that, quote, jazz and C&W have much in common, including Western swing's use of head arrangements and instrumental sectionals. In interviews, Western swing musicians advocated for jazz status. When Tex Williams covered Stan Kenton's Artistry and Rhythm in 1948, Williams assured his readers, cowboy bands are not all corn. We can do things in a progressive jazz manner too. And it was too weird to not put it on the program here, so I'm just going to play a short clip of that. So sort of a strange piece. I wanted to share that. Despite Williams's assurances of jazz status, a review of the recording in Downbeat concluded, this is an unemulsified mixture of Kenton-esque progressivism and cowboy-style jazz. It doesn't add up to anything but babble. Finding such items in the pages of Downbeat should not necessarily surprise. As Matt Brennan has shown, Downbeat covered a wide range of genres at mid-century, even as it placed jazz at the top of its aesthetic hierarchy. Following a lull during the 1960s, Western swing coverage returned to jazz journals sporadically in the form of retrospectives and reviews of record compilations. Reviews range in tone from curious to dismissive. Writing in Cadence in 1980, Carl Brower admitted, I can't see what all the fuss is about. Except for very few of the musical groups presented, Western swing is dull, inane, hackneyed, infantile. The following year, Richard B. Cammons struck a more conciliatory tone, finding, quote, a great amount of jazz sprinkled in amongst the blues and country sounds, and making favorable comparisons to Fats Waller and Stefan Grappelli. In 1983, again in Cadence, Bob Rush questioned Western swing's jazz legitimacy, claiming, Western swing is related to, but distinct from jazz, and is ultimately more aligned with country music. These recordings will probably have little interest to the jazz student. A survey of jazz histories and reference works suggests a similarly ambivalent attitude. This slide presents my ongoing catalog of jazz scholarship that engages with Western swing. I include here only works that aim for a comprehensive view of jazz history or relevant eras. Sources highlighted in blue mention Western swing, comprising about 31% of the sources thus far, and much more work to do on this. Rationale for inclusion or exclusion can be mystifying. The Venerable New Grove Dictionary of Jazz, first published in 1988, includes entries for both Western swing and Bob Wills, and both are tellingly written by the country music scholar Bill C. Malone. Malone writes that Western swing musicians, quote, improvised like jazz bands from whom they borrowed freely. He thus stops short of explicitly defining Western swing as jazz. The discographies, the Penguin Guide to Jazz and the All Music Guide to Jazz, both omit Western swing entirely. The editors of the AllMusic Guide define jazz as, quote, music that emphasizes improvisation and always has the feeling of the blues. While Western swing often fits this definition, it appears in the AllMusic Guide to country music, indicating that marketing and social categories, rather than style, primarily define the genre for the editorial team. Narrative histories of jazz tend to treat Western swing in passing, as a curiosity related to the larger phenomena of swing jazz and territory bands of the 1930s. To take one example, Gunther Schuler's exhaustive 900-page work, The Swing Era, The Development of Jazz, 1930 to 1945, mentions Western swing only twice, and only once in the main text, where Schuler describes the music as an amalgam of multiracial styles that included jazz. The relative dearth of coverage within jazz historiography suggests Western swing's marginal position in the view of critics and scholars. These figures have a host of artistic and socio-historical reasons for engaging in such gatekeeping. As David Ake, Charles Hiroshi Garrett, and Daniel Goldmark observe in the 2012 edited collection Jazz Not Jazz, debates over jazz boundaries and hierarchy have persisted since the genre's inception, hinging on such diverse issues as style, artistic and commercial aspirations, race, gender, geography, and more. Resistance to Western swing is multifaceted. As Christy J. Wells has argued, jazz historiography has typically privileged jazz for listening at the expense of dance-oriented swing of the 1930s. The critical perspective that has framed dance and vocal music as less legitimate artistically may have discouraged Western swing's acceptance. Furthermore, standard histories foreground New Orleans, Chicago, and New York as the major centers of jazz development, taking only brief detours to Kansas City, the West Coast, and other vibrant U.S. and international scenes. Western swing is subject, perhaps, to some of these same geographic biases. But more significant is jazz's own hard-fought battle for respectability, one which is inseparable from class and racial politics. Lawrence Levine and Scott DeVoe have both argued that the narrativizing of a jazz tradition has sought to grant jazz artistic legitimacy within a U.S. cultural hierarchy that has traditionally privileged classical music and attendant ideologies of whiteness and class distinction. At times, this has meant mimicking the classical music world in its anti-commercial stance, its modernist faith and stylistic progress, its canonizing impulses, and its institution building within and outside of the academy. Western swing's fun-loving populist aesthetics and its working-class image perhaps rendered it incompatible with these art world aspirations. Jazz critics and historians in general have felt little urgency to uplift an ostensibly hillbilly demographic. On the other hand, as Ingrid Monson has shown, jazz discourse since the civil rights movement has increasingly emphasized Black artistry as core to the genre's identity. Uplifting jazz thus becomes part of a broader effort to redress historical injustices faced by African Americans. Inevitably, some white musicians and historians have pushed back against this narrative, attempting to reframe jazz as multiracial, colorblind, or simply as American. Although nuanced, Richard M. Soothalter's 1999 monograph, Lost Chords, White Musicians and Their Contributions to Jazz, 1915 to 1945, has faced significant criticism for asserting a greater role for white musicians in jazz history. By glossing over Western swing's almost exclusively white performance history and its patterns of Black appropriation, Western swing advocates participate in a similar racial revisionism that fails to engage a broader racial consensus within the jazz community. Instead, they wield the term jazz as a marker of prestige and class uplift, forgetting the original racial stakes of the jazz apotheosis. Above all, the debates around Western swing reflect the continued political utility of inherited genre categories. The country and jazz labels introduced in the 1920s by record companies and other media industries have undergone divergent paths in the intervening decades, with jazz achieving a much more respectable status than country. Caught in the middle, stylistically, it's unsurprising that Western swing musicians and fans would emphasize their jazz allegiances, while jazz aficionados might seek to bar the entry of low-class country. Yet both sides of the debate are united in their adoption of the industry logics of racialized market segmentation and aesthetic hierarchy. This stance forecloses other ways of thinking about Western swing. For example, rock historians have long cited Western swing as a major influence upon rock's development in the 1950s. Bill Haley, the famous singer of Rock Around the Clock from 1954, was originally advertised as a Western swing musician. And Bob Wills was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1999. In this telling, Western swing becomes part of a transgressive music that broke racial barriers and reinvented youth culture. This alternative perspective is, of course, beset by its own biases, omissions of fact, and faulty logics. Nevertheless, it dispenses with respectability politics to suggest a more radical, perhaps more progressive interpretation of the genre that could appeal to different kinds of audiences. Instead, investment in a country jazz binary offers limited horizons, perpetuating what can feel like a zero-sum game of prestige and aspiration, shame and contempt. Thank you.
Questions for Sam? And I'll ask again if everyone could please introduce themselves to the room.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Stephanie Vanderwell. Thank you, Sam. This was a great paper. I really enjoyed it. Wonderful research. Can you hear me? Or okay, okay, you can hear me. So I was, as you investigate, with your research in the jazz country binary, I was wondering if you've come across the category of Western, because in my research, I there was a lot of pushback against the hillbilly label, because country music has so many labels,
Right.
old-time hillbilly, Western, and some of like Patsy Montana and her probably not very good Western swing band that accompanied her, for her big hit, Cowboy Sweetheart. They would be like, we're not hillbilly, we're Western, and I would
Right.
see this repeatedly in the fanzines and in the promotional material, like separating hillbilly and Western out, and Western being this, right, with all of the tropes of Manifest Destiny, this more romanticized and elevated, as far as the hierarchy goes from hillbilly. Do you think about that, or do you come across that? And
Right, I mean,
yeah.
this is sort of one kind of hillbilly disavowal, right? But the
Yeah.
whole history of the singing, as you know, right? The whole history of the singing cowboy in the 1930s was, we want to be more popular, right? And we want to be more respected. So one way we can do that is get rid of the straw hats and the overalls,
Right.
have a more polished sound, and some of it will come from the jazz music world or the pop music world. But we're also going to need to give it a different label, because if people call it hillbilly, then we have a limited audience in that way, because people don't want to be associated with that, right? So I see them as related phenomena, because everyone is trying to avoid specifically that hillbilly label. I think what's interesting here is how these terms change over time, right? Because in the 1930s, jazz means one thing, and people have talked about, is it really just the same thing as pop music? Is it something separate? And so when Western swing musicians, not hillbilly musicians, when Western swing musicians are using that term jazz in the 1930s, I think it means something a little bit different from how people perceive it now, or even 1970s and beyond, right? It's real frustrating dealing with these genre labels and genre categories. And one thing that I didn't get into here that David Brackett is talking about, has written about this idea that whenever we talk about the concept of genre, even to critique it or challenge it, we have to reify the genre first. So that's been a real challenge with this paper as well. And I think the country or Western is a part of that idea also. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. Hey Sam, AJ Kluth. Building off that last question about Western and whatnot, I'm curious, which jazz was this trying to align itself with? You mentioned 1930, I think of Paul Whiteman's idea of jazz. And you think of the King of Jazz film, which is insane.
Right.
It has
I was actually going to show a clip from that, the Joe Benuti thing.
Right. Yeah, so it has that final sequence of the Great Melting Pot, and it's all of Western Central European cultures, right? And it's like, oh, this is the Great Melting Pot that is jazz, and not represented conspicuously is blackness, right? So I wonder which jazz are we talking about if these folks are trying to associate themselves with that in this period?
Right, and I think that's another thing that it changes over time, right? The first example I played, the Tiger Rag version, is more in sort of a New Orleans Dixieland style, and as you saw from that other picture of Spade Cooley, once they're on the West Coast and they have a bigger audience and they have more money, right, it broadens to this more big band approach. So Western swing can actually mean many different things stylistically, and I think they're trying to emulate Dixieland, they're trying to emulate big band swing, and even the Tex Williams is like, I don't know, it's progressive jazz, whatever that means. In terms of who are they trying to emulate, I mean, there are stories about Western swing musicians going to after-hours jazz clubs in the Jim Crow era and talking with, learning from black musicians. But I think they're also open to sort of the more Paul Whiteman, white side of the jazz equation in the 1920s, 1930s as well. They're absorbing those things. They're also absorbing things that are going on in Texas. The presence of accordions points to the influx of Central European immigrants there. So it's very diverse and eclectic, and I don't want to use the melting pot metaphor for the problematic reasons that you point out, right? But I think the whole of what they understood jazz to be in the 30s, they're pulling from a lot of those different things. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's helpful. Yeah, sure. So we're still implicating this love and theft idea and all of the temporal issues about race and power.
Absolutely, I would say so. And it's interesting if you look at the Western swing historiography, they don't talk about race that much. When they do talk about it, it is to say, oh, well, they had dinner with Earl Hines this one time, right? And they met Duke Ellington at such and such venue in Chicago, right? And it's not to sort of challenge the racial politics, it's an authenticating move, right? When they do bring up race, it's, oh, well, they actually learned from black musicians directly, so that definitely makes it jazz.
So competing narratives, yeah. But yeah, in any case, the music's amazing. It was a great paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Hi, thanks. Terrific paper, very good, Millbury College. Just to sort of follow up with that and to take it into a little later chronological period, in terms of what kind of jazz our Western swing musicians are trying to align themselves with, it seems to me that by the late 20th century, you could find some alliance with jazz manouche, with Django Reinhardt and Ron Grappelli, which I think of as another type of jazz or not jazz that is primarily quiet and string instrument based. Can you say anything about that connection?
I think it's harder to say. I mean, my research is primarily focused on these groups in the 30s and 40s. From what I've read, they aren't listening to jazz manouche so much. And by the time we get to the 70s and beyond, groups like Sleep at the Wheel are sort of the big revivalist band. Again, I don't think they're engaging too much with that scene. I think they really are, at that point, they're just trying to capture former glories of Western swing specifically. There might be some progressive elements and other things mixed in, but it does seem like they're fairly committed to the style that was developed in the 30s and 40s. But certainly something I need to look at more and see if there is that sort of transatlantic relationship.
Hot club downtown, just.
Oh, right, that's a good point, thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to make my question quick this time. One thing I get from Bob Cantwell's stuff is that if you're really looking at jazz's influence on country, you should look at bluegrass, which really kind of took old-time music and then amped it up with extremely virtuosic, fast-tempo solos. Obviously, they had no ambitions to say, and we're a form of jazz, and bluegrass just has its own particular sphere. It does strike me that Western swing has those ambitions and kind of those Hollywood ambitions, which I also think is tied up with Western swing. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comparison. I've wondered about the bluegrass question, but as you alluded to, I think the sort of social stakes and the ideology around bluegrass is very much about this is from a specific place, a specific tradition, right? And any outside influence is going to somehow dilute the purity of the genre, which I think Western swing is more just the bluegrass and bluegrass thing as well. But yeah, it's an interesting comparison. Thank you for that.
Hi, Peter Burkholder. Thanks, Sam, for a terrific paper. I'm curious about another angle, which is if they're trying to distinguish themselves from country, are there arguments about we don't do this, the country does, and you know, we don't do that aspect of the country?
I think the main thing that I've found in the discourse is just the virtuosity of musicians, right? So there's kind of this disparaging of country music as being very simple, 2 or 3 chords, and not a lot of hot licks or fast solos, right? So that's been the main thing that I've seen, but I mean, it's interesting if you look at, it will let me go, if you look at some of these pictures of how they're dressed, I mean, it is this Western wear style. And going back to Stephanie's point about there's a disavowal of kind of a hillbilly appearance, but there's still, I mean, they'll still have cowboy hats on, so they go for this Western look. Sometimes, especially early on, they will have a more sort of middle-class respectability appearance, and you see some of that going on here, but by the time we get to the 1940s, it really is, I mean, they adopt this Western look, this Western persona as part of their image, so it feels still pretty closely related to country music, or contemporaneous country music in that way. I think the main thing is the disavowal on style terms.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Sam, Jacob, and Ingrid for their papers this morning, and thank you all so much for being here for the first session of SAM 2024. Have a wonderful conference.
Sorry. That's all right.